In 2004, the University of Oklahoma's president, David L. Boren, created the Presidential Dream Courses. These courses offer OU faculty the opportunity to dream, crafting a unique community of learners, networking some of the world's best scholars to engage OU students. As a result, the University of Oklahoma offers courses and degrees that compete internationally, equipping students for bright futures. Select faculty at the University of Oklahoma are awarded funds to enhance semester-long courses already scheduled for the academic year. This funding brings in several content experts during the semester to interact with students in the community. The visiting experts often deliver public lectures, helping to celebrate teaching and learning, empowering dedicated faculty to build a community of learning in Oklahoma and beyond. Students and others interact with visitors of influence and importance in policymaking, strategic planning, and scholarship as they network with academic leaders and researchers. We invite you to explore the learning and teaching dreams of OU's esteemed faculty, helping your own dreams grow larger than you ever imagined.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you especially Dr. Prashad for inviting me and for designing what I think is an ideal course and something I would like to teach someday. And also I wanted to thank the University of Oklahoma community. I had a great time visiting the honors class today. I thought we had some good conversation and some great questions. Hopefully this will contribute to sort of that class understanding of the issue and maybe bring up some new questions. And also want to thank the Office of the President for funding such an interesting course that contributes to the dialogues that you all are having in the Honors College, which is exciting. So what I want to do is I want to start first with kind of bringing you back to where I was when I began this research. A lot of you can remember on April 15th, 2013, 2 bombs that were detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. So there were 3 deaths, hundreds of injuries, and numerous amputations associated with these bombings. The psychological effects were equally traumatic, although less quantifiable. The reactions of the city and the state and the nation were quickly visible. American flags were hung, and Boston Strong appeared as a Twitter hashtag, and I think a lot of you have probably seen this. And American baseball, the American pastime, Fenway Park had kind of peppered itself with Boston Strong, right? And you're probably wondering how this relates to orphans in Malawi, but I'll get there. This slogan was meant to be demonstrated to the world that we were not going to be divided, that we were tough, that we stood together, that we were a strong union that could overcome outside attacks with resilience and commitment to each other. So for those of you in here who remember 9/11 well, which I know some of you don't, which always ages me, but it was the same kind of, in anthropology we like to look at artifacts, and the American flags that were raised after 9/11 and the sense of Americanness was very visceral, and this was pretty similar in many regards. So where was I? This occurred at the end of semester at Michigan State when I was teaching in a college of public affairs. And less than a week after these attacks, I was slated to stand in front of 250 students and ask them to identify where they drew their circles of affiliation in determining who mattered to them, right? So do you draw your circle at family, at local communities, at the nation, as many would suggest after something like 9/11 and Boston Strong, or do we take a global perspective? And so my students were really grappling with this idea of patriotism and what does it mean to be patriotic. We were teaching Martha Nussbaum's For Love of Country. So when you have a violent attack on your soil, what is your inclination? Is it to become a strong union? And what are the ramifications of that identity, right? If you believe in a union and a strong union, what does that mean for those who fall outside the union? How do you then conceptualize the rights and the well-being of somebody who doesn't fit within this patriotic discourse? And my students were mixed. We had mixed feelings. We had people who were very isolationist and who said, yes, we need to come together, we need to protect our borders, we need to secure what it means to be American. And other people said, no, we live in a global world and we need to acknowledge humanity across borders. And so this was what I was grappling with at the time I was also conducting this research. And so Martha Nussbaum, who draws a lot on old political theory dating back to Aristotle, and I'll talk a little bit about that, really was focusing on this idea of compassion, right? So this idea of affiliation, who deserves our compassion? So one of the things that she has argued is that to encourage an engaged global citizenship. We need to move beyond this very small idea of a patriotic worldview to one that extends compassion to all people. And early political thinkers believed that this was the foundation of liberal democratic society, right? So we talk about Aristotle or Adam Smith, and I'll reference them in a minute. So compassion, according to these Western philosophical traditions, is thought to be a central bridge between the individual and the community. And I'll unpack this a little bit. But it's basically how we as a species hook our individual self-interest to those of others, which is really what I'm interested in when I look at international volunteering. In this presentation, I rethink some of my work, but I also explore what compassion means as it is realized in deliberate actions via student volunteers trying to serve both Malawian orphans, but also Malawian patients. So I've included in this a discussion of the emerging practice of international medical experiences or clinical tourism, where young students also go over to Malawi, often tied to orphanages, but are really trying to work in clinics also and practice medicine overseas. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So what does it mean when they go to these places to provide care to poor patients? So I'm really looking at the uses of compassion, but also its limits in terms of political theory. And so I have some evidence, because I was noting, this was all prior to the current political environment, I was noticing or thinking that my students really were more engaged globally than, say, my generation or my parents or my grandparents. And I was just hypothesizing that we were more compassionate. And this also happened to coincide with Steven Pinkert's controversial book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And I found parts of it convincing. It all depends on how you define violence. But his argument is that we are less violent today than at any other moment in human history. And he defines violence in complicated ways, but the idea is that, because of globalization and technology, we now extend compassion to people beyond our immediate worldview and to a global audience. And I kind of bought into that idea. Anecdotally, when it comes to tourism, we see a huge growth in volunteer tourism happening in the last decade or so, and the same with international medical experiences. Tourism research and marketing data from 2008, which is really dated but still the best that we can find right now, suggests there's annually somewhere between 1.6 and 10 million, which again, pretty broad range of people going on these young students going on volunteering trips to the developing world. But that's a substantial number. And then when we look at international medical experiences, between 2008 and 2011, there's a 25% increase in medical school students or pre-med students going on international medical experiences. And in fact, 30% of medical students will have done an international medical experience during their medical training. These are pretty substantial numbers that suggest that there's something happening that's bringing people out of the US and the local context and taking them into places like Malawi. And I see it on the ground when I get on the plane, and a lot of you who have traveled to Southern Africa can see this. There are lots of groups of people wearing the same t-shirts, that hand in hand, holding hand, here we go, off to do some kind of volunteer trip. So those are pretty ubiquitous now. So there is this sense that we are able to, I'm going to argue, extend our compassion to these ever-growing circles of affiliation. And I'm going to try to suggest that it's because of compassion tied to media depictions of suffering subjects that are circulated by transnational humanitarian organizations. So that's a lot, but I'll get there, don't worry. I argue, though, that there are some negative consequences to these experiences. Some of them are pretty well documented, of which I have documented some of them. This idea of the neo-colonial white savior myth being perpetuated, the further entrenchment of asymmetrical power relations, which I'll actually touch on, the disruption of local economies, the commodification of children, and the fracturing of local kinship systems. And so these are all very visible signs of negative outcomes. While I'm one of these critical scholars, I was also a volunteer tourist as an undergraduate, and I went on a trip like this to the Dominican Republic. So I also understand what it means to sign up for one of these trips and how it changed me as an individual. And I felt like, as I was kind of moving forward with this research, that I didn't want to be overly negative, that there's got to be something positive going on. And so I really was trying to figure out what motivates these young volunteers, because I don't think it's a bad thing. I actually think it's a good thing for young people to want to take time and money and effort to go to a place that's uncomfortable for them for the most part. They've never been. And so I didn't want to just catch myself writing all these negative things. I was really kind of exploring this place of compassion because I think compassion's a really good thing at the end of the day. But what I've discovered is that it has its limits, and I'm going to kind of highlight those limits, but I don't want to just end on that. So hopefully I'll be able to bring you back to some of the ways that compassion is good, because it comes off as a little bad. I want to discover what motivates young people and how their moral sentiments shape their experiences overseas and how it changes the ways they perceive and approach suffering subjects. And I'll talk a lot about suffering subjects because the entire industry of volunteering with orphans and with sick patients is predicated on the category of a suffering subject. And that gets circulated in lots of ways, and I'll show an example of how Madonna does it, because she's Madonna. So you gotta always throw in a little Madonna. This is not to suggest that the only motivation is compassion. People volunteer for lots of different reasons to go overseas, but at its core, compassion is what makes it even possible to do it, because without compassion based on this idea of somebody suffering, there is no reason to go and do this kind of volunteering. So that's why I think compassion is an important place to start. So I'll talk briefly about what compassion is, how I'm using it, because I think that that will be helpful. Then I'm going to relate it to transnational humanitarianism. So when I say transnational humanitarianism, I'm referring to Doctors Without Borders, to CARE International, to the Red Cross and Red Crescent Society, to these big organizations that we can identify. Even though the people that I study are not working for those organizations, my argument is that those organizations, based on suffering subjects, create new spaces for young people to become humanitarians. I'll call them amateur humanitarians because they're not professionals in the way that Red Cross workers are. They're short, superficial type experiences where people go to try to do good. The reason they exist is that this larger machinery of transnational humanitarianism opens up spaces by creating and circulating ideas about suffering that move us to action. And so that's essentially the argument. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I hope it becomes evident that the construction and circulation of easily identifiable suffering victims or categories of victims, so orphans are a pretty easy victim to be moved in terms of having compassion for, it's central to the existence and maintenance and moral positionings of these larger organizations. They don't exist if you don't have suffering subjects. And so they're foundational to it, which my argument is ends up being problematic. It's not just orphans, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit. They're all meant to generate a compassionate response from a sympathetic viewer. A lot of times that was always a monetary donation. You know, with the Red Cross, you see the devastation and you text the number and you donate $5, right? So, but what's happened now with globalization is that now, instead of just texting a number or sending a t-shirt, you can actually get on a plane and target these suffering subjects. So these organizations are creating these new spaces. I also argue that when these young people have these experiences, they come back and add to the larger transnational regimes by circulating similar images. So part of my research is on social media. So those other two pictures, the ways in which these young people were depicting their experiences in the orphanages. And there's a lot that gets circulated about Malawi that I argue is also depoliticizing, very, and very simple in the way it represents childhood, that actually perpetuate the larger machinery of transnationalism as well. And that I think this is problematic, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of counter that. So this is what I'm kind of looking at. I'll eventually talk about their stated motivations related to compassion, but describe how their resulting actions don't necessarily resonate with contemporary notions of justice. So there's humanitarianism, there's human rights, and there's development. These are kind of the three big categories of international engagement. They're not that categorical, they're murky, but in many ways we can see the difference between humanitarianism and human rights, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And I argue they can lead to some antagonistic interventions where things go awry. So what is compassion and how do we think about it? So one of the things that Peter Singer, who's also controversial, but he said, we need to increase our moral consideration of the other, that's what compassion is about, right? So anything that it makes it easier to imagine trading places with someone else increases your moral consideration of that person. This is one of three foundational aspects to compassion that Aristotle identified. So what are the three foundational aspects of compassion? The first is that this idea that suffering is severe, so that it's not stubbing your toe. It's somebody is suffering in a profound way. That's the first element of a compassionate response. The second is that the person suffering is undeserving of their suffering. So in my work, it's orphans and sick patients that are the receivers of compassion. So these are fairly innocent categories, and there's a judgment call that they are deemed to be worthy of a compassionate response because they don't deserve to be suffering. And then the last is that you can imagine trading places with them. There, by the grace of God, go I. And we'll see how that plays out in some of the ways these young people try to actually generate a compassionate response from donors. So historically, we have applied this empathy to those within our frame of reference, but as it grows, we are now kind of reaching out beyond what were the kind of smaller concentric circles of affiliation. So for Rousseau, and then again, I don't want to get into too much theory, but this idea comes out of this idea of self-love, and this is important to consider. Self-love is because you have to suffer in him, right? To be able to have a compassionate response, you have to suffer in the person that you're extending compassion to. You must identify with the sufferer, so it's about self-identification, and this is what leads to action, right? So the idea is that if you love yourself, and you see yourselves in another, and they're suffering, you're gonna help them because you would want to be helped if it was you. And that's the idea. And this is hierarchical, which is where one of the problems with compassion comes in that in order to be the giver of compassion, and hence the giver of aid, there has to be a receiver. And there's a hierarchy involved and asymmetries of power involved in that dynamic that becomes problematic when we look at orphans and patients. So that's basically kind of how I'm conceptualizing it. This links to a host of scholars studying transnational humanitarianism because compassion allows us to now project ourselves onto, as well as for your generation, into the lives of those once very distant from ourselves. And this has led to action. This is kind of some of the MSF. I've taken some of the pictures that MSF uses to garner a reaction, and this is kind of the crux of this idea of a suffering subject. So while humanitarian is one way of doing good, in order to do good, you have to have an appropriate suffering subject whose life needs saving. Otherwise, who are you going to do good for? This has to emerge to animate a compassionate response. So key players in humanitarianism and development create regimes or targets of legitimate intervention that transcend the individual organizations. So MSF, all these different organizations have the same categories of people. So here you have sick patients, here you have hurricanes, you have refugees. For me, it's orphans and sick patients. These are critiqued as superficial and simplistic in terms of our media understanding. So some of you in the class today talked about, the image of Africa is suffering and disease, or children isolated but joyful. And these are kind of the iconography that are necessary to have a humanitarian response. So it's been critiqued that these images are depoliticizing because they erase the entire context, and all you see is this very visceral suffering subject, which then creates a reaction. Immediately, I want to do something to help. This is kind of the main ways in which larger humanitarianism creates categories that young people then grab onto. For those who don't know, Madonna works in Malawi. At the time of this research, she had donated $3 million to orphan care in Malawi. She had adopted one child, almost two now, but at the time it was one. And she has started an NGO called Raising Malawi. This is her video, which actually has some heavy hitters in it. She's got Archbishop Tutu, she's got Paul Farmer, she's got Bill Clinton, she's got Jeffrey Sachs. And this is how she's framing it for her audience.
People always ask me why I chose Malawi, and I tell them, I didn't. It chose me. I got a phone call from a woman named Victoria Keelan. She was born and raised in Malawi. She told me that there were over 1 million children orphaned by AIDS. She said there weren't enough orphanages, and that the children were everywhere, living on the streets, sleeping under bridges, hiding in abandoned buildings, being abducted, kidnapped, raped. She said it was a state of emergency. She sounded exhausted and on the verge of tears. I asked her how I could help. She said, "You're a person with resources. People pay attention to what you say and do." I felt embarrassed. I told her I didn't know where Malawi was. She told me to look it up on a map, and then she hung up on me. I decided to investigate, and I ended up finding out much more than I bargained for. About Malawi, about myself, about humanity.
There is a phrase in the Zulu language that says, Umuntu ngubutu ngabantu. I am because we are. Think about it. I'm not defined without you.
First of all, like Madonna, really, like the white Madonna saving African orphans, like you can't write that, really. But there are several things to note. One is she talks about 1 million children orphaned by AIDS, which if you read the rest of my work, you know that that's not very representative of the reality. There are 1 million children who fit the UNICEF definition, which is having lost one or both parents. There are only about 50,000 children who are what we call double orphans, which is they've lost both parents to AIDS. Usually it's just one. Being abandoned, kidnapped, and raped in the Southern Africa context, and especially in Malawi, children are not abandoned because they're economic producers. So in the US, children, and you all, are what Sharon Stevens says, you are economically worthless but emotionally priceless to your folks, which is true, right? I mean, some of you might be contributing to your parents, but most of you are actually very expensive for your parents. In Southern Africa, children work at a very young age. They are economic producers. So this idea that you're going to have orphans running around who are abandoned, her words are abandoned, kidnapped, and raped, is absolutely false. And then what does she say? This is a state of emergency, okay? So now you have the perfect suffering subject that absolutely does not capture the reality of Malawi. But when you see that, what do you think? This is horrible. I have to do something, right? I mean, that's the idea. This, you know, it couldn't be any more devastating, right? And then she goes on, and then this is kind of how AIDS connects my work in terms of children and medicine. So this is then tied to these depictions that I think are important as well.
HIV/AIDS was like accepting defeat, which was a great pity. For several years, nobody was allowed to say anything about it.
The historical aspects of it are also very interesting because to talk about sex in Malawi, family planning or anything of that nature was taboo.
We are really poverty-stricken in Malawi, and with this scourge of HIV/AIDS, it's even worse. Because HIV/AIDS is even taking the lives of young men and women who are supposed to develop this country, who are supposed to contribute to the economy of this country, to the growth of this country. But as a result of HIV/AIDS, the economy of this country, the development of this country is being retarded. Because young people, educated people, are passing away every year, every month, every week in Malawi. People are dying of HIV/AIDS.
My argument is that the erasure of the aid recipients' complex lives and the political and economic reality that shapes their existence, however precarious it may be, makes humanitarians less accountable for their lived suffering. An apolitical suffering subject needing saving does not easily lend itself to human rights approaches that allow victims agency to make claims to particular entitlements. And what I think is significant about these categories is that what she's produced here is not anything new. This is very similar to what most organizations trying to raise money are doing and have done. But it creates these ripple effects that allow for and create space for young, inexperienced volunteers to bear witness to these distant, what I call mediatized forms of suffering and lead to their involvement in short-term humanitarian trips to make a difference and ease suffering. This is one of the first articles. This is the story about AIDS in Africa. Look at the pictures, read the words, and then try not to care. And these are the kinds of pretty common discourses that we see. What's problematic about humanitarianism and the literature on humanitarianism is that it is often what we call pro-charity. It's this idea that you have an immediate need and you're going to solve that need, and that's going to be it, that you've done your job. Whereas human rights approaches are understood as this legal claims that people can make about resources that should be afforded to them by the very nature of being human beings. Development is instead about kind of improving economic well-being, and there's this long-term investment about economic growth. And so while organizations take all kinds of ideological positions, and you have humanitarian groups taking rights-based approaches, what I'm finding is that the majority of amateur humanitarians, so the people that I'm interviewing, are squarely positioned in a traditional humanitarian approach with a focus on the temporal present. This coincides with the work of Wilson and Brown, who suggest that humanitarians, when driven by emotions and moral claims about compassion, sympathy, and empathy, are overly sentimental and at times neo-colonial. It's again the white savior handing the resources that will meet that person's need in a very short-term type of engagement. In contrast, they suggest that rights proponents make explicit claims and operate under the premise of entitlements and not charity, which affords recipients of support or aid more agency. The amateur humanitarians operate under a moral framework and less a legal bureaucratic one. Rights are not a part of their discourse concerning their work or volunteering. They are seeking intimate face-to-face encounters to actualize their compassion in relation to suffering subjects, and are not aware of or do not conceptualize structural historical perspectives. This is why justice is not a part of the participants' discourses. So let's talk about clinical medical experiences. This is kind of the ethnographic portion that I think you'll find more interesting than all the theory, but hopefully it will all connect. Max was a 22-year-old from Marietta, Georgia, and a medical school student at New York Medical College. He signed up to go to Malawi to volunteer in rural medical clinics. When asked about his reason for signing up and to reflect on his experience, he said, quote, "I basically just feel like regardless of your situation, the needy should be helped by those who are able to. There have been many times throughout this experience that I have felt a very universal theme to live. Just seeing children cry when they're in pain, reaching for their mothers. There are so many just universal parts of being human that have made me really feel like we're all part of the same story. And that it's almost like it's sort of like an existential guilt. Like, look at these people in Africa and see how destitute they are. I just feel so sorry because I didn't do anything to be American. I just don't see how it's fair for me to be in my situation and them in their situation. I take it as an obligation to actually act upon it and level the playing field in whatever way I can, which is just for me coming here." Max succinctly captures central elements of compassion. First, he acknowledges that suffering is severe. Children crying in pain, destitution. Suffering is seen as undeserved. So he references birthright and chance. And he can easily imagine being in their place. We are all part of the same story about the universality of being human. This compassion led him to actions that transcend the idea of just coming here. So what happened on his trip to Malawi? Max arrived with a clinician mentor and other medical students. They spent 3 weeks volunteering in rural areas. The mentor supervised the students for 2.5 days, then returned to the US. Without clinical or pharmacological training, yet still presenting themselves as doctors, the students displayed an inability to take vitals or make sense of medical records, admitted that they practiced without considering contraindications, and practiced trial and error medicine. They flirted with changing patients' ARVs and antihypertensive meds, despite having zero experience with those drugs. These services were rudimentary at best, and, as I originally argued, inhumane at worst. When reflecting back, Max said the best advice he received from his mentor was to, quote, "keep it simple. Just use the basic drugs, ibuprofen, amoxicillin, Tylenol. Don't try to make some profound discovery while you're here. Many other medical students have been in your shoes and done just fine." That was what she told him. He said, "I think that was very helpful because it took a load off my shoulders of feeling that I was harming a patient if I didn't get the diagnosis right." Ryan, an American missionary physician, posted at a charitable Christian hospital. He was a long-term missionary, had been there maybe 5 or 6 years when I interviewed him. Plays host to medical school students, interns, residents, and volunteer physicians on a regular basis. He finds little value in short-term trips and even less from students or individuals who are unable to dedicate actual services to the hospital. He also begrudges the outdated, expired, and useless medical supply donations that he has to sort upon arrival, often stuffed into traveler suitcases. He refers to these items as junk for Jesus. Particularly problematic is the assumption that expired drugs are somehow acceptable to give to Malawian patients. This is similar to Claire Wenlin's hypothetical juxtaposition of an American medical school student without a medical license, traveling around rural Zambia, practicing medicine beyond their means, and being touted as the brave, selfless hero, to that of a Zambian medical student, also without a license, doing the same thing in rural America, being deemed a negligent criminal. One is an act of compassion extended by the wealthy West to the impoverished Africa, and the other would probably end up in the courts. This neatly maps out the humanitarianism/charity approach to that of human rights and entitlements. The practices described in my work were driven by compassion and the notion that some of a particular type of medicine beats no medicine. Compassion is claimed and granted based on an individual's willingness to apply effort toward a project in the third world setting, no matter the quality or even the legality of the actions. Patients are conceptualized not as rights-bearing citizens entitled to quality care, but rather apolitical suffering masses or bare lives, to borrow Gambon's term. Didier Fassin describes this as a politics of compassion rather than a provision of entitlements, and a rights justice framework is obscured here. Compassion doesn't lead to justice, and justice alone, some argue, doesn't necessarily lead to the alleviation of suffering. So what about orphans? The founder of one of the orphan-focused organizations I was studying explained how he goes about garnering support for his organization and the young people he hopes to help, stating, quote, "There are some tactics you have to employ in order to be a successful nonprofit in the US. AIDS helps us to raise money if we explain it sufficiently well." He illustrated how he invokes AIDS by recounting the story of a suffering child, emphasizing her wasted dreams and lost innocence. This raises money and interest, and it generates compassion, targeting a very specific demographic. Quote, "If you can open people up in a non-threatening way about the life of another person, like what happened to this girl can happen to my own child, then one story can relate to another person's. I want them to feel like, quote, I see myself reflected in that person's story," end quote. That person's story, he believes, will generate a donation at minimum, but is also leading to direct engagement with suffering subjects. So we go to Chad, and those who read my articles know Chad. I change his name all the time. I can't remember what he's called in yours. Chad, an undergraduate zoology major at Auburn, found himself at Mtendere Orphanage during the summer of 2009. He was one of over 200 visitors the orphanage would host that year. I asked Chad why he decided to come to Malawi and what he had learned. Quote, "I know that people there need help. I can give what I can give, and why should I not give it?" So that was kind of my response. I think that starting with people close to, at the time he said your age, which was a while ago, and he was wrong. I was like 10 years older than him. But I feel a lot more of push to be like a humanitarian, right? So he's identifying as a humanitarian. I think that we are looking more abroad than maybe our parents or grandparents did. Well, it's obvious that we care a lot about that kind of thing. And to me, that feeling has coincided with a duty. I'm not some bringer of everything. I can't release people from poverty, but I can do what I can do. So why should I not? Chad is a self-proclaimed humanitarian who also exhibits the central tenets of compassion, but there's something peculiar about his perspective that needs some attention. Let's recall that compassion requires blamelessness, not only on the part of the object, but also of the onlooker. Blamelessness is a judgment. Central to many notions volunteer tours have is that poverty and suffering in Malawi, especially in regards to children and poor patients, is both blameless and an obfuscation of what is actually happening. Suffering is about chance, a roll of the die. And that could easily have been one of us. So the idea of compassion is that you can imagine yourself in their footsteps. And on top of that, there's this idea of blamelessness, so that it could easily be you because they're not being blamed for their suffering, and you also aren't being blamed for being implicated in their suffering, which is part of the problem. So Chad explains, why is there poverty in Malawi? Well, I don't know. One of you quoted this in class today because it's a little bit tough. Why is there poverty in Malawi? Well, I don't know. This continent has remained unchanged for a really long time. And why technology developed elsewhere? I don't know. Why education has progressed further elsewhere? I don't know. But it just happened that way. I don't know why. Maybe it's just isolated so much. It's in the middle of a big continent. Chad suggests he simply doesn't know. It seems to come down to just plain bad luck for Malawians facing poverty. While birthright might be luck of the draw, there are very deliberate systems at work that create opportunities and shape the circumstances of our lives. Respondents did not mention structural violence or systems that produce inequality. There was no acknowledgement of the scramble for Africa, colonial history, the precarious period of decolonization, the current democratization process, structural adjustment, global capitalism. It was by chance that Malawians were poor. Social responsibility is thus alleviated. Both sides are blameless. Compassion here probably won't lead to justice, especially economic justice, because it is not acknowledged or understood. What's more, as I've argued elsewhere, the ramifications of this perspective don't end in Malawi, but are extended to US poverty. Chad continues. I don't think I used this one in the article. I used a different perspective because so many have this. Most people in Malawi that I've seen are not homeless, but I think that they are worse off than someone in America who doesn't have a home. I've been to some of the rural villages and driven through them. So just by being there and driving through them, he's now an expert on rural poverty in Malawi. It's just, they own nothing, and every day is a struggle just to make it through. That's what poverty is. And some of the feelings I've started to have about American poverty is those people can really help themselves more than these people can. I don't know. I don't want to be bitter about it. Like, it's just like, it seems like you can almost climb out of it a little bit in the United States. But here, there's just no opportunity. And so we can unpack all of the problems about this idea that Malawians can't climb out of it, whatever it is, without the assumption of what? A Western hand helping them. It was really common for volunteers that to say Malawians living in poverty need our compassion and action, whereas the US poor are at fault for their own suffering, justified via hegemonic notions of the American dream and Protestant ethic. These compassionate young people are actually missing the commonality that exists between those living in systemic inequality and the lack of capabilities that exist despite geography. Compassion can prove to be a misguided moral sentiment, leading to an erasure of suffering, which is kind of what's happening when people look at our own rural and urban poor. Someone struggling against poverty in the US or Malawi are in fact often sharing in similar cycles of violence. But here, the onlooker makes a judgment about whether someone is blameless for their suffering and deserving of a compassionate response. In this case, the US poor don't qualify. These ethnographic snapshots illuminate the limits of the uses of compassion in civic and political life. Other critics have claimed similar shortcomings that I think are related to the missing element of justice. Nussbaum acknowledges that compassion is related to justice, but is not sufficient for justice since it focuses on the need and offers no account of liberty, rights, respect of human dignity. Most volunteers demonstrated the potential superficiality of compassion. Suffering is imagined as an existential condition, as Max states, and in the process, political and social conditions get misrecognized. Compassion also runs the risk of being merely transient. Virtually none of the volunteers or medical school students were committed to a long-term sustained commitment to the orphans or patients they worked with. Justice, as opposed to compassion, by definition requires sustained commitment. A shallow reaction to exoticized poverty allows asymmetrical power relations to remain firmly embedded, and necessary actors and institutions needed to ensure justice receive no dedicated attention. Marx argues that without justice, compassion can boil down to a kindness extended by the rich and powerful to the weak that requires no obligation binding on all. Despite these shortcomings, Nussbaum posits that developing a moral pedagogy that ensures compassion as an emotional bridge between the individuals and the community can act as a bridge to justice. And that via compassion, at least, we become aware of someone else's privation, which allows us to consider how and why claims to justice can be made. So I'm not saying compassion is a horrible thing. I'm saying that it's just the first step of actually being able to think about how to meet or make sure people's needs are met. So how can we encourage said bridge? How can we promote compassion as a basic social emotion to engender a more benevolent community predicated on rights and entitlements, which would be my ideal world? Beyond the appropriate confines of the family, Nussbaum calls for institutions to teach citizens and have dream courses where they invite lecturers like myself to come and share this. Just make sure you're awake. To teach them about basic goods, responsibilities, and appropriate concern for humanity. She cites education, beginning in elementary school, that allows us to both imagine and participate in the suffering of others as a bedrock to ensuring a more compassionate and, by extension, just world. A pedagogy that gets students, and I think considering our contemporary political environment, both in the United States, but when we look at what's happening globally, a pedagogy that gets students to cross boundaries of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, religious ideas, it is the only way to actually combat the majority of the violence that we see today. She specifies that ensuring a compassionate citizenship, there must be a multicultural dimension to this pedagogy, making strangers, whether they be strangers in your own backyard or strangers that are living in different places, that transcend our families, communities, countries, and cultures, less other, seems to be a key to decreasing violence and encouraging cooperation and peace. Coupled with teaching critical thinking that unpacks and challenges students' assumptions and ideologies, can also make visible the underlying hegemony of systems that oppress and marginalize. And through these endeavors, educated and compassionate people can inform and shape liberal democratic public institutions. I had my whole go out and vote discussion in the class today, because I think that we are seeing the ways in which these liberal democratic public institutions can shift and change the way that they approach a whole host of issues as they arise. So in this paper, I've tried to highlight how compassion is a motivating factor for volunteer engagement in Malawi. I argue that it's not enough to ensure the end of suffering, but rather it must be tempered with rights and justice and long-term commitment. Without a focus on this, the recipients of humanitarian aid, whether orphans, the U.S. poor, or sick Malawi patients, are conceptualized not as right-bearing citizens deserving of quality care, but rather as apolitical suffering bodies or bare lives, which can lead to problematic forms of humanitarian engagement. As demonstrated above, compassionate individuals wanting to bring relief to the suffering may actually be silencing or misrecognizing the systems that create that suffering to begin with, and compassion may not be extended to those who are in actuality deserving of it. This would have to move compassion into the realm of the unconditional. The notions of compassion and morality as used by program volunteers and administrators necessitate a re-examination of rights ideologies and sentiments of justice. This is particularly true with the acknowledgement that globalization is bringing the wider circles of shared humanity closer to home, but the types of engagements that occur within and between those closer circles have proven to be less than equalizing. But it's through programs such as these that we can begin to think through a different way of global engagement that can be productive and positive for both volunteers and the communities within which they find themselves.